So we're still, 11 days, I guess, away from the college football playoff, the Fiesta Bowl, 4 p.m. Eastern Time on New Year's Eve, TCU in Michigan, and the Peach Bowl, 8 p.m. New Year's Eve, the two college football playoff games. I want to talk today about, I do a lot of live shows, and there's been a lot of call-ins, comments, things like that I've seen over the last week, not just here on my channel, but in a lot of different channels, about the matchup in this game involving Ohio State's wide receivers versus Georgia's defensive backs. Basically, Ohio State's passing game versus Georgia's defense against the pass, and in particular, the secondary. It reminds me a little bit of a lot of the talk we heard heading into the Georgia-Tennessee game. Now, Tennessee's offense is nothing like Ohio State's offense, so I don't want anybody to take this the wrong way. Ohio State's offense is a grown-up, real offense. Tennessee's offense is a gimmick. Their wide receivers run three routes. A go route, a curl route, a slant route. I mean, that's literally it. It's not... What Tennessee does offensively is not complicated. Their whole deal is let's run plays as fast as we can and try to trick people. I'm not comparing the offenses that way, but I guess what I'm saying is, we heard a lot of, how are Georgia's DBs going to handle that passing game? And you're kind of hearing a lot of the same thing now about the Georgia and Ohio State game. And I wasn't right on my analysis in the Georgia-Tennessee game, but I'm going to give basically the same analysis here. It's what I think will happen. I think Ohio State's wide receivers as a whole are the best in the country. I think Marvin Harrison may be the best wide receiver in the country. No disrespect to Jalen Hyatt or whatever other wide receivers you want to name. I've seen Marvin Harrison make multiple catches this year that all you can do is shake your head and it's just unbelievable. Ohio State's wide receivers are the real deal. Now, they're missing Jackson Smith and Jigba. How much does that matter? Well, it matters in that he's a legitimately great wide receiver, right? He's an NFL wide receiver. He's a first-round draft pick. He is a elite talent at wide receiver. So not having him matters in that respect, but Ohio State has played basically the entire season without him, right? There's a difference, I think, in losing a guy, in the middle of the year, towards the end of the year, or something like that, versus maybe not having him at all. But with Jackson Smith and Jigba, it's really more of like a George Pickens situation from last year with Georgia. Now, George Pickens did end up playing a little bit towards the end of the year, a few snaps in the conference championship game, a handful of snaps in the first round playoff game, and a handful of snaps in the national title game. But for the most part, George Pickens was a non-factor. He had that one amazing catch in the playoffs, but it's more like that. So in that respect, it's like, would Ohio State be better if they had Jackson Smith and Jigba? Yes. Is Ohio State going to be worse in the playoffs than they were at any week during the season because they don't have Jackson Smith and Jigba? No. They didn't have him for the majority of the year, so you kind of can take that however you want. But, no one, I hate that he's injured. I hate when anybody gets injured. But if Ohio State was going to sustain an injury that was going to prevent a player from playing in this playoff game, the one position group they can probably most afford to absorb that injury is at wide receiver. They're just loaded. I mentioned Marvin Harrison, but you also have Emeka Egbuka. And, they have two or three other guys that are most likely future NFL players. They may not get the attention right now because Harrison and Egbuka are getting a lot of that attention, but they're just loaded across the board with wide receivers. And they have a really, really good passing attack and an NFL quarterback that can get them the ball. There's no doubt, no question about it. C.J. Stroud is a legitimate quarterback. You look over at Georgia's defense, if you want to talk about NFL talent, well, you got Kelee Ringo, right? He's probably going to be the first defensive back taken in the NFL draft this coming April, a top 10 pick. One of the fastest players in all of college football. It's hard to beat him deep in terms of outrunning him. Maybe you make a better play over the top of him. There has been some occasions where Kelee Ringo kind of seems to lose the ball in the air, maybe doesn't get his head turned around. But as far as beating Kelee Ringo in the traditional sense, in terms of beating him 5 yards, being 5 yards back, that rarely happens. So he's a legitimate NFL talent. Christopher Smith, one of the best safeties in college football. Malachi Starks is a true freshman. Other than that, it's hard to find anything wrong with him. He's probably the most athletic of the defensive backs at UGA. He's made some circus type interceptions this year already as a true freshman. You're always concerned with a true freshman, though, that is, he's going to get his head out of the game for a play or two and get caught looking the wrong direction. That's always an issue you have to worry about with true freshmen. You have Kamari Lassiter, who plays the corner opposite Keely Ringo. He's probably the least talked about defensive back at UGA, and I've been pleasantly surprised with Kamari Lassiter this season. You rarely hear his name mentioned when you watch a Georgia game. Typically, that's a pretty good sign when you're a DB. He's particularly good against the run and against screen passes and hitch passes, swing passes, passes at or behind the line of scrimmage. He closes on those quick passes as fast as anybody in all of college football. If you're a Georgia fan or if you've watched Georgia games this year, you know what I'm talking about. Kamari Lassiter blows up a lot of these hitch passes, screen passes, hitch passes, 2 or 3 yards deep in the backfield. He's a physical corner. In fact, I think when it comes to physicality, playing the run, tackling, he's much better than Keely Ringo. Keely's got some of the physical attributes that you look for in terms of size, speed, hand size, wingspan, vertical jump, those kinds of things. Kamari Lassiter might actually have better instincts, though, defensive back instincts, and be more physical at the point of attack than Keely Ringo is. Javon Bullard, who's the nickel corner, another one that's played really, really well this year. There's no real weakness across the board in Georgia's secondary. Now, I know Keely Ringo did not play well in the second half against LSU, and in fact, the last 2 games of the season, Georgia Tech, which was the regular season finale, and then the LSU game, the SEC championship, both those teams, Georgia Tech and LSU, came out and threw right at Keely Ringo early and often. All game, attacked Keely Ringo. And both teams had some success. The majority of LSU's success, of course, came in the second half. And look, since that game, you haven't heard me make, there's no excuse for the way Georgia played in the second half of that game, giving up all those passing yards to Nussmeier after Jaden Daniels got knocked out of the game. It's not a situation where Georgia was playing backups. All those DBs I just talked about, they were all in the second half of that game when Nussmeier threw for almost 300 yards in the second half. We weren't playing some kind of soft zone. We were playing the same man coverage we played in the first half, mostly. There was a little bit of zone, but it was mostly that same press man. The one thing we did do differently in the second half that we didn't do in the first half, we didn't make a decision to really pressure Nussmeier. And that's a decision that Georgia paid for through the air. Nussmeier wasn't completing 4 and 5 yard passes or passes behind the line of scrimmage. He was completing passes 30 and 40 yards in the air downfield. I mean, he lit Georgia's secondary up. There is no sugarcoating it. It was really, really bad. I'm willing to admit that. I'm also willing to admit and tell you that nothing I saw in the second half of that LSU game gives me more concern or greater concern or anything like that heading into the Ohio State game. The reality is, you can't ignore this reality. I just told you what the reality of the second half was, and I didn't make a single excuse. But the reality is, Georgia was up 35-7 at halftime in that game. And if you've watched Georgia games, especially this year, Georgia has a philosophy. They like to get up on teams, and then they sort of flip the script. They slow the offense down, 7-8 minute drives, right? Try to limit possessions, that kind of thing, and they kind of just go into a turtle shell. That's not to make an excuse for the way the defense played. It's just, that's why it doesn't concern me heading into the Ohio State game. I don't view the second half of the LSU game as a red flag for Georgia's defense. Why? Well, getting back to the point I made about the philosophy that I think Georgia's defense is going to have heading into this game as it pertains to Ohio State's passing attack. Heading into the Tennessee game, really heading into the Florida game the week before that, Georgia had not done a very good job of sacking the quarterback. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. They had played some teams with some scrambling type QBs, and it was obvious Georgia had made a decision to try to contain those quarterbacks rather than kind of send the house type of deal, a lot of spying of the QB, that kind of thing. In the Florida game, that kind of changed. Several sacks in the Florida game, and in the Tennessee game, it really ramped up. And Georgia finally made the decision to get after the quarterback. It was clear if you watched the Tennessee game that Georgia's plan heading into that game was to put their corners on an island, press man coverage, right, and attack Hendon Hooker. Get him on the ground, sack him. That's what they did. It worked, and it made Hendon Hooker very uncomfortable. I think that will be Georgia's plan heading into this game as well. As good as I think Georgia's secondary is, and I think Georgia's secondary might be the best in college football across the board, there's not a secondary in America that is going to hold up over a 4-quarter game if you're letting C.J. Stroud sit in the pocket for 4, 5, 6 seconds, waiting on those wide receivers to get open. As good as Keeley is, as good as Kamari Lassiter, Malachi Starks, Christopher Smith, all those guys, as good as they are, they cannot cover Marvin Harrison, Emeka Egbuka, and those other Ohio State wide receivers for 4, 5, 6 seconds all day long. It won't happen. Georgia's going to have to get pressure on C.J. Stroud. That does a couple of things, right? It seems obvious. The less amount of time you have to cover a wide receiver, the more likely you are to be able to cover them, right? So if C.J. Stroud's only got 2 or 3 seconds to get rid of the ball, that's a better case scenario for Georgia's DBs than having 5 or 6. Again, this is very obvious stuff. I'm only bringing it up because I've seen Georgia employ 2 different philosophies in terms of how they attack QBs this year. And I think this is going to be the Tennessee philosophy we see against Ohio State. I think they're going to attack C.J. Stroud, blitz him early and often, and try to get pressure on him, try to force him to get rid of the ball early, which will make it easier for those DBs to try to contain Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka. Will it work? Well, that's what we're going to play the game and we're going to find out. But that's what I think the philosophy will be for Georgia defensively. Who's going to win the battle overall, Ohio State's wide receivers or Georgia's DBs? Both. And this is where I talked about the Tennessee game and got this part wrong. I said a similar thing about the Tennessee game. I said, look, Jalen Hyatt's going to beat you a couple of times, probably catch a couple of touchdown passes. He's too good not to, I still feel like that's going to happen in the Ohio State game. It did not happen in the Tennessee game. Georgia was able to completely shut them down. I don't expect that to happen in the Ohio State game, mainly because Ohio State's offense is just more complicated and honestly more talented. Ohio State's got a better offensive line, in my opinion, than Tennessee. They've definitely got better. As good as Jalen Hyatt is, Ohio State's got a better group of wide receivers than Tennessee did. As good as Hendon Hooker is, I think C.J. Stroud's a better, just pure quarterback than Hendon Hooker is. So I think Ohio State is more talented. So even though I was wrong about Tennessee being able to score a few times over the top of Georgia's defense, I still think Ohio State is going to be able to do it. I still do. I don't think, as good as Georgia's DBs are, that they're going to completely take those guys out of the game. You're talking about a Heisman caliber QB and multiple NFL wide receivers, including probably the best wide receiver in football, Marvin Harrison. I have a feeling they're going to make some plays. I also have a feeling Georgia's DBs are going to make some plays, whether that's Malachi Starks or Christopher Smith. Christopher Smith has come up huge in big moments throughout his career at UGA. Does Keely Ringo have sort of a national championship type game, right, that he had last year against Alabama where he played really well? We're going to find these things out. I think Georgia's DBs are going to make some plays. I think C.J. Stroud might be the best quarterback in football. He's one of the best 2 or 3. I wouldn't be surprised if he throws a pick. I think Georgia's secondary has the ability to make a play, especially if Georgia's defensive front is able to get Stroud under pressure. Maybe he has to hurry a couple of throws. Maybe he gets a little bit rattled if we knock him down a couple of times and he makes a mistake and throws a pick. It would not surprise me, just like it would not surprise me if Marvin Harrison, Emeka Egbuka, or both had a couple of long touchdown passes. I don't think this is a situation where Georgia's going to hold Ohio State to 6 or 10 points. Maybe I'm wrong. I've been wrong about that before with other type teams, and Georgia has seemed to smother them. I just don't think that's going to happen here against Ohio State, partly because of a running game, which I'll talk about in a different video. I wanted to primarily talk about Ohio State's passing game versus Georgia's defensive backs here. I really feel like it's a push there. I really do. I think Ohio State has the best wide receiver group in America, and I think Georgia might have the best secondary in America. I think overall in this game, that particular matchup is probably going to be a push. I expect the secondary to win some matchups for UGA. I expect the wide receivers to win a couple of times for Ohio State. That's honestly what I think will happen. I think the sort of deciding factor in that is going to be the lines of scrimmage, right? Can Georgia pressure C.J. Stroud? Can they get to him? Can they sack him? Can they knock him down? Can they chase him out of the pocket? If they can, I think that tilts the advantage towards Georgia's DBs in that matchup versus the Ohio State wide receivers. If Georgia's not able to pressure C.J. Stroud, if he's able to sit in a clean pocket and read the defense and make throws, I think that is a huge advantage for Ohio State's wide receivers in their matchup against UGA's DBs. Two really, really talented groups here. When you're looking at Ohio State's wide receiver group and Georgia's defensive back group, two really, really talented groups. How many NFL players combined do you think there are between Ohio State's wide receivers and Georgia's DBs? 7 or 8 probably. If you go total roster, even the back, because look, Ohio State's got wide receivers, you've never even heard their name before. Next year they're going to have 1,000 yards receiving. That they're just loaded. Georgia's that way with DBs. It's going to be a very interesting matchup. Tons of NFL talent here. Ohio State's wide receivers versus Georgia's DBs. Let me know what you think about that matchup down below. Have a good morning.